Hey, well, good morning, Catalina Fields Church. It's Pastor John Stone here with our Tuesday morning devotion. And we're working through the book of Acts. And we saw last week that Peter was called to Cornelius' house and God had to show him a vision. And actually the story takes up two entire chapters, 10 and 11. And 11, we'll see how actually the church resisted this. But when he did actually get to Cornelius' house, and we see this in chapter 10, and begins to preach. He actually begins to preach in verse 34 of chapter 10, because Cornelius explained to him why he called him. And when Peter begins to preach, from verse 34 down to verse 43, he preaches, which is actually not a very long sermon. It's, I mean, we can probably read that in 2 or 3 minutes. But it says, verse 44 is really interesting. While Peter was still speaking these words, the Holy Spirit came on all who heard the message. The circumcised believers who had come with Peter were astonished that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out, and it says even on the Gentiles. For they heard them speaking in tongues and praising God. And I mean, there's a lot here, and it's sort of interesting, but I'll just make two simple points. They aren't related, so these will be like two totally separate points, but it'll be good for your thoughts. One, when God prepares somebody by the Holy Spirit to receive the message of the gospel, you almost can't mess it up. I mean, what's interesting is Peter reluctantly, God had to give him a serious vision, and then he goes without reluctance, but he's nervous. In fact, he said when he got there, it's against our laws to hang out with Gentiles. But God has made it clear that I can't call anything unclean that he's declared clean, meaning now the Gentiles are clean. And then he asks Cornelius why he calls him, and Cornelius tells him about this vision, and then Peter begins to preach, and immediately the Holy Spirit falls on them. And it's important, I think, to see that it says, for they heard them speaking in tongues and praising God. And what you have is the exact same thing that happened at Pentecost for the Jews is now happening here in the presence of the most important apostle at that point, Peter, who is clearly the leader of the apostles in Jerusalem. He comes as a witness with others, and they see that the same Spirit that God poured out on them was being poured out on the Gentiles. And they're really blown away by this. And in fact, in chapter 11, we'll see that it's actually hard for them to accept. But the first thing to see is like when God prepares somebody for the Holy Spirit and for the gospel, just any push, any words, any call to believe in Jesus, and they will. And I think one of the things that should encourage us to do is to pray more that the Holy Spirit would come on people. So as you think about your family members and friends and neighbors that you want to see be born again, I think you need to pray, God, I pray that the Holy Spirit would go and work on them, because when the Holy Spirit comes, they're ready to believe, and they're really ready to receive the message of Jesus. And often we can spend years trying to get people to believe, when maybe what we should do first is pray. We should certainly go and preach the gospel to them, but we need to pray that they be prepared by the Holy Spirit. And there's just probably people, when I finish making this devotion, this is going to convict me to pray for the Holy Spirit to fall on some people I know. The second thing that's interesting here is that God is having to work really hard to get his people to go out into his mission. So we're months now into the past Pentecost, and it's clear that the Jewish believers are still struggling with their Jewish identity. Peter is having to have visions to tell him to go down and spend time with the Gentiles. And when he gets there, he says, our Jewish customs, but you're no longer Jewish, Peter. Now you're a Christian. And he's really struggling with that. And they're wanting to stay in Jerusalem. And yet Jesus said, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost ends of the earth, as we saw earlier in Acts, and they're not doing it. So now the Holy Spirit is forcing them out. He forced them out through persecution. But now he's having, since they won't go preach the gospel, he's sending an angel to tell a pagan Cornelius to send for Peter, so that when Peter gets there, he can preach the opening paragraph of his sermon, and they can be born again, so the gospel will go out. Because Jesus is about the gospel going out. He's about new people hearing about the gospel and about it reaching new people. Not just new people groups, but people who've never heard it before. But that's hard for Christians. It's interesting because we love the gospel. We love to hear the good news about Jesus, and we want to tell others, but there's something hard about it. It was hard in Acts, and it's hard for us. One of the reasons we're doing Trunk or Treat is just to meet new people. And we may not evangelize anyone that night, but we just want to meet people because it's hard. There's resistance in our hearts, resistance in our culture, just resistance because sin is in the world from us going out. And here, God is having to do the going out. And I just want to challenge us to think about new people and even new places and trying to meet them and trying to go to them and just recognizing it's incredibly hard to get new people into the gospel. So Acts chapter 10, 11 is fun. We'll be in Acts chapter 11 next week. I look forward to seeing y'all at Trunk or Treat on Saturday night and then in service on Sunday morning or online or in person. Have a great Tuesday.